Every exit locked in under 10 minutes. The smell reached her first. Cedar, and something cold underneath it. The particular air of a room that had never once been left unlocked without reason. Serena Carver, 28 years old, former corporate attorney turned wife of convenience to a man whose name certain people in this city said only in private, had just placed a divorce filing on the desk of Dominic Vasquez, head of the Vasquez family, and the only person in a 5-state radius who could make a room full of armed men go completely still, with nothing more than the way he set down a glass. She had placed the papers there because she had spent 11 months preparing them, because she had been patient, because she had told herself that patience was the only weapon a woman in her position could safely carry, and because at 6:17 in the evening she had decided she was done being patient. Every man near a door moved his hand to his jacket but did not reach inside. That was the first thing she noticed. Not fear, readiness. Dominic looked at the papers. He did not look at her. The document was 12 pages, professionally bound, filed that morning with the court in Manhattan. He had been told it was coming by her attorney 3 days ago. He had not responded to that notification. He did not respond now. He reached forward and turned the first page with 2 fingers, read something near the top, and then placed his hand flat on the surface of the desk. His wedding ring caught the light. He had never once taken it off. She had noticed that early, when it still felt like something other than a detail she was cataloging. "I want this done before the end of the month," she said. She kept her voice even. She had practiced even. "My attorney has your attorney's contact information. Everything is straightforward. Equal division of assets held in both our names, which is nothing, because nothing was ever put in both our names. No contested property." She paused. "I just need your signature." He turned another page. The 2 men near the service entrance on the left side of the room had not moved. One of them, a man she knew only as Reyes, had his eyes on the window instead of on her. That was not normal. Reyes always watched her when she was in this room. In 2 years, she had learned to read the rhythms of this house the way you learn to read weather. Not because you enjoy it, but because it is safer to know what is coming. Dominic. She said his name the way she said most things to him now, flat, without ornamentation, a word used for utility, not warmth. "I have a life I would like to return to." He closed the file. He set it to his left. He finally looked at her, and the thing in his expression was not anger, not contempt, not the cold authority she had learned to navigate in year 1 of this arrangement. It was something she had no good word for, the closest she could find. Standing there in her gray dress in his study, with the city spread out 40 floors below the windows, was the expression of someone who had been told something they already knew would happen and had hoped, in spite of knowing, would not. He said nothing. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been doing it for 2 years. "I'll have my attorney call yours," she said at last. "Tomorrow. I'd like this resolved," before her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She did not reach for it. Phones did not take priority over this conversation. The phone buzzed again, then a 3rd time in rapid succession, which was not how her phone usually behaved, and she felt, without being able to explain it, a shift in the temperature of the room. Not physical, something else. Dominic looked past her, toward Reyes. Something passed between them without a word, a glance that lasted less than 2 seconds and contained a complete sentence she could not read. Reyes moved, not toward her, toward the door. She heard the heavy click of the magnetic lock engaging, a sound she had only ever heard before when Dominic was in a meeting that required absolute privacy. She turned. The door was closed. She looked at the windows, 2 floors below the roofline of the adjacent building. She could see a detail she had never paid attention to before. A set of reinforced shutters on the exterior that had been folded back flush against the stone since the day she arrived. They were no longer flush. They were moving. "What is this?" she said. It was not a question. He stood. He was taller than she remembered each time, which was irrational because she saw him nearly every day. But something about moments of confrontation always returned her to the first impression of him. A man constructed deliberately, not assembled by accident. "Sit down, Serena. I would like to know what you just did to the exits. I know what you would like." He moved around the desk toward the window, not toward her. He stood with his back to her and looked out at the city below. The shutters on the exterior had stopped moving. They were closed. "Your phone. You should answer it." She reached into her pocket and looked at the screen. 3 missed calls from her father. Elliot Carver. That was unusual. Her father called her on Sundays, not on Tuesday evenings, not 3 times in the space of 90 seconds. She called him back. He picked up on the first ring, which was also unusual, and his first words were not, "What a father says to a daughter he is worried about." "Did you give it to him?" Her father said. No greeting. His voice was lower than his normal register. A careful voice. A voice that she had heard him use exactly once before. When she was 12 years old and he had been on a call, he did not know she could hear through the wall of his study. "Serena, did you hand him the papers?" "Yes," she said. A pause, and he hasn't signed. "I've been in the room for less than 10 minutes. Dad." Another pause. Longer. She could hear him breathing. She looked at Dominic's back. He had not moved from the window. "Listen to me," her father said. "I need you to stay calm. Do not push him tonight. Do you understand me? Don't push." He did not wait for her answer. The call ended. She stood holding her phone and looked at the room around her. The locked door, the closed shutters on the exterior of a building she had believed, for 2 years, was merely the private residence of a very powerful and very inaccessible man. Her father had said, "Don't push." Not, "Are you safe?" Not, "I'm coming." Not, "What is happening?" Don't push. She put the phone in her pocket. Dominic turned from the window. His expression had settled back into the thing she was most familiar with. Controlled. Unreadable. The face of someone who has decided how much of themselves a given room is permitted to see. He looked at the divorce filing on the left side of his desk, without touching it. "You'll stay here tonight." "I live here," she said. "That's not a concession." "I mean, you won't be leaving the property." She looked at him for a long moment. She was good at that too. "You cannot keep me here." He held her gaze and said nothing, and the silence was its own answer. Not cruel, not triumphant, but the silence of a man who knows exactly what he can and cannot do and has already calculated it. 37 minutes earlier. She had been standing in the private car that brought her back from her attorney's office on Park Avenue, the signed copies of the filing in her bag, a very simple plan in her head. Walk into his study, put the papers down, ask for a signature. She had believed, for 11 months of preparation, that this was a transaction between 2 people, a contract unwound by consent. She had been a corporate attorney. She understood contracts. She understood the mechanisms of exit. She had been entirely certain. Standing in that car, with Manhattan moving past the tinted windows, that this was merely the last step in a process she had already completed. She had not considered the possibility that the process had never been what she thought it was. She had not asked the right questions. She had been so certain she knew the shape of her situation that she had never once turned it over to look at the underside. 37 minutes earlier, she had been a woman with a plan. Now she was a woman standing in a locked room, with her father's voice still in her ear, saying, "Don't push," and a man across from her who had not once, in 2 years of living in the same house, ever explained to her why. Exactly. She was there. She sat down, not because he told her to, because for the first time since she had walked through the doors of this house as a bride at 26 years old, she thought that perhaps she had been asking the wrong person for answers. She did not sleep well. The room they had given her 2 years ago was still her room. The same pale curtains, the same view of the East River, if she stood at the right angle near the window. The same silence, that was not quite silence, because this building was never completely quiet. She had grown used to that particular quality of stillness, the kind that came not from emptiness, but from deliberate containment. She had grown used to a great many things she had not planned on growing used to. In the morning she dressed carefully, the way she always dressed in this house, not to impress, not to perform softness, but because control over small things had been the one reliable form of control available to her. She wore the dark blue that she knew made her look like a woman with somewhere to be. Then she walked downstairs and tried the front door. A man she had never seen before was standing 3 feet from it on the inside. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply existed between her and the exit in a way that made the situation perfectly clear without requiring anyone to say anything unpleasant. She went to the kitchen instead and poured herself coffee and sat at the island and called her attorney. The call went to voicemail on the first try, which was not unusual at 8 in the morning. She called again at 8:30. Voicemail again. She called the office line at 9 and spoke to the receptionist, who told her that her attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had worked on this filing for 11 months and who had never once failed to return a call within the hour, was not available and would call back as soon as possible. Patricia Hale did not call back. At 10:15, Serena put the phone on the counter and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the coffee she had stopped drinking. Then she looked at the window above the sink, where a narrow sliver of sky was visible between the buildings across the street. The particular sky of a New York morning that could not decide between gray and something lighter. She thought about the way her father had said don't push, as if pushing was something she was doing to a piece of furniture rather than to the circumstances of her own life. Her father arrived at 11. She heard his car before she heard him, the particular sound of the building's private elevator opening onto the main floor, which was a sound she had memorized in the first month here, because it told her when someone important was arriving. Elliot Carver was 61 years old and looked, as he always did, like a man who had once been powerful and had never fully adjusted to the recalibration of that power. He wore a charcoal suit. He carried nothing. He kissed her on the cheek when he saw her in the sitting room, the same kiss he had given her every Sunday for 2 years. And then he looked past her toward the hallway that led to Dominic's study. "How are you feeling?" he said. The question pointed at her, but his attention was elsewhere. "I'm locked in," she said. "How do you think I'm feeling?" He finally looked at her. Something moved across his face, and then was gone. "It's a precaution. These things take time to arrange properly." He said it as though she had asked him why the mail was late. He said it with the specific flatness of a man delivering a line he has rehearsed, just enough that it no longer sounds rehearsed. "Dominic is being careful." "Careful," she said. "It's complicated." "Serena." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She did not move away. She had learned not to move away from things she needed to read. "You'll understand more soon." He walked down the hallway. She watched him until the study door closed behind him. She counted. 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, the door opened again, and her father walked back out. He did not stop in the sitting room. He told her he loved her from the doorway, his coat already in hand, his eyes on the floor between them rather than on her face. The elevator opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. She stood in the sitting room and thought about the fact that her father had not once, in the entire 22 minutes he had been in this building, looked directly into her eyes. That afternoon, she found reasons to move through the house. This was not unusual for her. In 2 years, she had mapped every room she was permitted to enter, every corner where the light fell at a particular angle, every place where 2 hallways met and sound traveled in directions that surprised you. She was a woman who paid attention. She had been paying attention for 2 years and had believed, until yesterday evening, that she had a reasonably complete picture. Now she was revising that picture, and revision required information, and information required movement. She was passing the door of Dominic's study for the 3rd time, under the pretense of retrieving a book from the shelf at the end of that corridor, when she saw through the partially open door a frame on the far wall. She had been in that study perhaps 40 times over 2 years. She had not noticed it before because it was positioned at an angle to the door and partially behind the edge of a bookshelf. What she saw now was the side of a frame, dark wood, the corner of what appeared to be a photograph covered with a piece of dark fabric that had been folded over the top. Not a blank wall, not a painting. Something that had been deliberately obscured. She noted it and kept walking. In the evening, she sat on the small terrace off the 2nd-floor library. The air had a bite in it. Early October, pressing against the glass of the season. And she pulled her cardigan close and thought about architecture. Not the architecture of buildings, the architecture of what she did not know. She had been constructing a theory of her marriage for 2 years based on visible evidence, and the visible evidence had told a coherent story: arranged marriage, indifferent husband, mutual tolerance, clean exit. But the visible evidence, she was now understanding, was a surface. Beneath it was a structure she had never looked at. She had not looked because she had not believed there was anything beneath it worth seeing. She had been wrong about that. One of the younger guards, a man in his mid-20s named Marco. We came to tell her the terrace would need to be secured at 8 in the evening. He said it the way all of Dominic's men said things to her, with deference and without warmth, which was a specific combination she had always read as loyalty to their employer rather than hostility toward her. But Marco lingered at the door a moment longer than the message required, and she looked at him, and he said, with the careful tone of someone who is not sure how much he is permitted to say, "You should know, Mrs. Vasquez, that this is not the first time someone has tried to arrange for you to leave the property." She kept her expression exactly where it was. "What do you mean?" He looked at the floor, then back at her. 3 months ago, and before that, once more. Both times Mr. Vasquez received the contact and handled it. He stopped. He had said as much as he was going to say. He stepped back from the door. 8 o'clock. "Mrs. Vasquez." She nodded. He left. She sat alone on the terrace with the city spreading out below her and the sound of traffic rising from 40 floors down. That constant low register that was as close to silence as Manhattan ever came. And she turned Marco's words over the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath. Someone had tried to arrange for her to leave, not the same as trying to help her leave. The phrasing was specific, and she was a woman who had spent years paying attention to the specific weight of words. Tried to arrange, as if leaving were a transaction, as if she were something being moved from one place to another rather than a person choosing her own direction. 3 months ago. She tried to remember 3 months ago. Her father had visited twice in close succession that month, which she had attributed at the time to his occasionally erratic affection. She had not attributed it to anything else because she had not had any reason to. She went inside at 7:50 and stood in the hallway outside Dominic's study. The door was open. He was at his desk, a phone to his ear, speaking in a low voice. She was not close enough to hear the words. She was close enough to hear. When he paused, and the other voice on the line said something, the name her father went by in the circles that were not his family life. Not Dad. Not Elliot. The other name. The name she had heard only twice before in her life. spoken in rooms she was not supposed to be in. The name that belonged to a version of her father that existed before she was born, and that she had always told herself was a past version. A closed chapter. Something her father had left behind and paid for in ways she was not privy to. Dominic said that name in a very quiet voice, and then said the words, "The deadline has moved." He said something else she could not hear. She backed away from the doorway before he could turn and see her standing there. She walked back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and looked at her hands and did not turn on the light for a long time. There was a word for the feeling of discovering that the story you have been living inside was not the story you thought you were in. She did not have that word in English. She was not sure she had it in any language. What she had instead was the sharp, particular clarity of a woman who has just understood that the questions she had been asking for 2 years had been the wrong questions entirely, and that the right questions were going to require a kind of courage she had not yet been asked to use. She turned on the lamp. She looked at the door. Tomorrow, she decided, she was going to start asking the right ones. She found him at 7 in the morning. Not in the study. Not in the room she associated with his authority. But in the long kitchen at the back of the building, where the light came in low and flat at that hour, and the city outside was still deciding whether to wake up. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and a newspaper he was not reading. He looked at her when she came in, and then looked back at the newspaper. She poured herself coffee. She stood on the opposite side of the island and looked at the grey surface of the counter between them and thought about how to begin. She had spent most of the night thinking about the word arrangement, the word her father used when he spoke about her marriage. Not love, not commitment, not even the more clinical word, contract, arrangement. She had always understood it to mean the practical nature of the union. 2 people agreeing to a social and legal fact with no particular emotional investment on either side. That was how she had understood it for 2 years. It had felt clean, in its way, manageable, but arrangement could also mean something else. Something organized in advance by people other than the ones living inside it. She had been thinking about that second meaning since approximately 2 in the morning. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer me honestly. Not carefully. Honestly." He set the newspaper down. "Those aren't always the same thing." "I know." She looked at him. He looked back. This was new. This quality of looking at each other directly instead of navigating around each other's edges, and she felt it as a kind of pressure. Not unpleasant. More like the feeling of a room coming into focus after a long time of letting it blur. "Why won't you sign the papers?" A pause. He turned his coffee cup once in his hand. A small rotation, and then set it down. "You know I'm not going to answer that. You've had 2 years to answer things, and you haven't answered any of them." She heard the edge in her own voice, and did not soften it. The edge was accurate. "Why did we get married? You've never told me. I've asked twice, and you've changed the subject both times. I'm standing in a locked building, asking you a 3rd time, and I would like a real answer." He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to do it again. Redirect her. Give her a fragment of information wrapped in so many qualifications that it arrived as nothing. Instead, he said, "Because the alternative to us being married was worse than the marriage." He said it with no inflection at all, which was its own kind of answer. The tone of a man who has rehearsed something long enough that it has been stripped of everything except the words, "Worse for who?" He looked at her. "For you," she said. "For me. For my father. Worse. For who?" The silence stretched. Outside, a delivery truck moved through the street below, and the sound of it rose and faded. His expression did not change in any visible way, and yet something in him shifted. A microscopic adjustment. The kind that she had learned over 2 years to read the way a sailor reads wind. Not by seeing it, but by feeling the change in the surface of everything around it. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at her with an evenness that was not coldness and was not warmth, but was the specific look of a man making a decision in real time. "If I sign that document," he said, "you will not be safe." He said it the way you say something you have been holding for a long time. Not with relief. Not with drama. But with the precise tiredness of a fact carried too long in one direction. "That is not a threat. I am telling you what is true." She kept very still. "Explain that to me." "I can't explain it fully." He moved to the window. The city was lighter now. The particular luminescence of a New York morning after a cold night. Everything slightly too bright before the day's grime settled over it. "What I can tell you is that the situation outside this building is not what you think it is. The arrangement that brought you here was not arranged by me." She felt something cold move through her chest. Slow and precise. Like water finding a crack. "What do you mean it wasn't arranged by you?" He did not answer. She was beginning to understand that his silences were not indifference. They were load-bearing. He did not say things he could not unsay. And the things he refused to say were often the ones that carried the most weight. "My father," she said. It was not a question by the time it left her mouth. He turned from the window and looked at her. And in that look was something she had not seen from him before. In 2 years of proximity, the look of a man who is relieved that someone else has said the thing he could not say, and who is also, beneath that relief, profoundly sorry. She set her coffee down on the counter. Her hands were steady. She was a woman who had trained herself to keep her hands steady, not because she felt nothing, but because feeling things visibly had never once helped her. "I need air," she said. "I'm going to the terrace." He did not stop her. She stood on the second-floor terrace for 40 minutes and watched the East River moving below the city and thought about a Tuesday afternoon when she was 23 years old and had walked into her father's study without knocking and found him on a call. He ended the moment he saw her. He had been speaking in a voice she had not heard before, a voice she had filed away and not reopened. She thought about the 2 visits in close succession 3 months ago. She thought about the way he had not looked at her yesterday. She thought about the word arrangement and what it meant when it referred not to a marriage, but to a daughter. She went back inside just before 9. She spent the morning in the library on the 2nd floor with a book she did not read and a window she looked out of more than she looked at the pages. At 1:30, she heard voices in the main corridor. Dominic and someone she did not recognize, and the conversation ended before she could make out words. At 3, she heard his phone ring in the study below the library. A single ring, and then silence, which meant he had answered it immediately. She came downstairs at 4. She walked past the study. She was not pretending to retrieve a book this time. She stopped in the hallway outside the partially open door and stood and listened. His voice was low, but the house was quiet enough and she was close enough. He was speaking to someone he trusted. She could tell that from the register, from the absence of the careful formality he used with people who required managing. He said, "The contact from the Moretti side is confirmed." A pause, while the other voice spoke. "Then tell them the position has not changed. She is not available for transfer." A pause, because Elliot made a second approach, and I need to know whether he's panicking or whether he's already decided. Another pause. Longer this time. If he's already decided, then she needs to know. I can't protect her from something she doesn't see coming. She stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and her heart beating with a steadiness that surprised her, because she had expected panic, and what she felt instead was something colder and more useful than panic. She felt the specific clarity of a person who has just had a large and shapeless fear resolve into something with edges, a shape she could see, a shape she could work with. She waited until the call ended. She waited another 2 minutes. Then she walked into the study. He was at his desk. the phone still in his hand, and he looked up when she entered, and something in his expression went very still. Not surprise, not quite. More like the stillness of a man who has known a conversation was coming and has been deciding what to say in it. She sat down across from him without being invited. She placed her hands flat on her knees. She looked at him. "Someone is trying to move me," she said. "Not help me leave. Move me. Like a piece in something I am not being told about." He set the phone down. "My father is involved," she said. "And you know how he is involved. And you have been keeping me here, not because you want to keep me, but because letting me go means letting me walk out into something you can see from here, and I cannot." A long silence. Outside, a siren moved through a street below and faded. He looked at her with the same unreadable evenness, and then said, very quietly, "Yes." One word. She had not expected one word. She had expected another redirect. Another careful architecture of non-answers. The directness of it landed differently than she was prepared for. "I need you to tell me what you know," she said. "Not yet." He held her gaze. "Not because I'm protecting myself. Because if I tell you everything now, you will make a decision based on incomplete information, and it will be the wrong one. I need 2 more days to confirm something." He paused. 2 days, and then I will tell you everything. All of it. Whatever you want to do after that. I will not stop you." She looked at him for a long time. She was measuring him. She had been measuring people for years. It was a professional habit. She had never been able to fully separate from the personal, and what she measured in him now was not warmth, and was not trustworthiness in any conventional sense. It was something more specific. The quality of a man who has been carrying a weight that is not his to carry, and has been doing it badly. Not because he is weak, but because he has never learned another way. 2 days, she said. 2 days. She stood. She moved to leave. At the doorway she stopped. She looked back at him, at his desk and the phone and the particular tiredness that had settled around his eyes in the days since she had handed him the divorce papers. And she asked the question that had been sitting under all the other questions since the evening before. The deadline your contact mentioned on the phone last night. What happens when it passes? He looked at her steadily. He said nothing. She nodded once. She walked back to her room. She did not need him to answer. His silence, this time, was enough. She did not wait 2 days. She had agreed to 2 days because agreeing had been the rational move. The move that kept information flowing in her direction while she gathered what she needed to understand the situation completely. But rational moves and patient moves were not always the same thing. And by the second morning, she had already decided that the document she needed was in that study, and that Dominic was going to be in the East Wing, meeting with Reyes and 2 other men until at least noon. She had learned the rhythms of this house. She had 2 years of rhythms to draw on. She went in at 10:45. The study was exactly as it always was. The desk, the 2 chairs facing it, the long shelves of books that she had privately catalogued in the first 6 months, and knew well enough to find any specific volume in under a minute. She did not go to the shelves. She went to the desk first and opened the left drawer, which was where she had once seen him file documents he was actively working on. The drawer held a leather folder, a phone charging cable, and a pen she recognized as the one he used for signing things that required a specific pen. She opened the leather folder. Inside were 3 documents, none of them what she was looking for. She moved to the cabinet behind the desk, a dark wood piece that matched the bookshelves. 4 drawers, locked. She pulled each one. The top 2 were locked. The third opened. Inside were folders organized by year. 7 years of them, neatly labeled with dates rather than titles. She went to the folder dated 12 years back. She pulled it out. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a property transfer. Irrelevant. The second was a letter in Italian that she could not fully read but caught enough of to understand. It was a communication between families. The third was something she set aside when she saw the fourth. The fourth was 41 pages, bound in the same way her divorce filing had been bound, with a clip at the top left corner and a cover page that was blank, except for a date and 2 signatures. She looked at the signatures first, before she read anything else. The one on the left was Dominic's, the precise, unhurried signature of a man who has signed many things and felt no need to make his signature into a performance. The one on the right was her father's. She recognized it immediately. She had seen it on her birthday cards until she was 20 years old and he had switched to texts. She had seen it on the consent forms he signed when she had her tonsils out at 9. She had seen it at the bottom of the letter he wrote her when she passed the bar exam, a letter she had kept in a box in her apartment on West 72nd Street, in a box that was now in storage because her apartment no longer existed because 2 years ago she had moved into this building as a bride. She sat down in his chair and read the contract. It took her 23 minutes. She read it the way she had been trained to read contracts, not for narrative, but for mechanism, for the specific language of obligation and consequence. She read the clause that established the terms of the marriage arrangement. She read the clause that described what Elliot Carver had provided to the Vasquez family 12 years prior, described in language so clinical that it took her 3 readings to understand that what it was describing was the location and daily routine of a person who had subsequently died. She read the clause that established what the Vasquez family had agreed to provide in exchange protection, specifically and by name, for Elliot Carver and his direct dependents for a period of not less than 15 years or until renegotiated by mutual consent. She read the clause that specified what happened to that protection. In the event of dissolution of the marriage, it was void, immediately and without appeal. She read the addendum, dated 4 years after the original document, that listed by name the families who had expressed interest in acquiring the protection contract from the Carver side. The Moretti name was there. So were 2 others she did not recognize. So, in a notation that had been added in a different ink and a different hand, more recently, was a figure beside the Moretti name that she understood without any explanation to be a price. Her father had tried to sell her contract to another family. She sat with that for a moment. She looked at the window. The light outside was the particular white of a cloud-covered noon, flat and even, the kind of light that made everything look slightly overexposed. She thought about the word dependence. She thought about the fact that nowhere in 41 pages was her name written as a person who had made a choice. She appeared in this document as a dependent, as a term, as a condition of a larger agreement, as the human equivalent of a clause. She had graduated at the top of her law school class. She had made partner at 27, the youngest in her firm's history, before she had given it all up because she had not, at the time, understood that giving it up was what she was doing. She had believed she was stepping into a difficult situation temporarily and that she would step back out of it with her life intact when the time was right. She had not known, because she had not been told. And she had not been told because the people who knew had needed her not to know. She heard the study door open. She did not startle. She had been expecting it. Somewhere in the back of her awareness, the way you expect a thing you have been moving toward. She looked up. Dominic was standing in the doorway. He looked at her sitting in his chair, with the contract open in her hands, and his expression was, for the first time in 2 years, completely unguarded, not devastated, not afraid, something quieter than either of those things. The expression of a man arriving at a point he has been dreading and finding, now that he is here, that he is less unprepared than he thought. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, which placed him in the position she was usually in, the visitor's position. the one without authority, and she did not think this was accidental. He laced his hands together and looked at the contract and did not try to take it from her. She turned to the cover page and placed it face up on the desk between them. She tapped her father's signature once with one finger. "He arranged this," she said. "Not a question." "Yes. Before I knew anything about it. You were told it was an arrangement between families." He held her gaze. "That was true. It was not the whole truth. The woman described in Section 4, she said, the one whose location and routine were provided. That was your mother." A silence that confirmed it before he spoke. Yes. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had not let herself look in 2 years, because looking had felt like a concession she could not afford to make. She saw, for the first time with clarity, the architecture of what he had been carrying. Not guilt. He had not been the one who gave the information, but something adjacent to guilt. The particular weight of being the person who accepted the terms of an arrangement built on an irreversible harm, who had looked at those terms and decided that accepting them was the only way to contain the consequences of the harm rather than allow them to spread. He had been 20 years old when his mother died. She knew that from the dates. He had been 23 when this document was signed. "You could have told me," she said. "If I told you, you would have left." He said it plainly, without accusation, as if it were simply a fact about physics. "And if you left, your father would have lost his protection, and his first move would have been to sell the contract forward to cover himself. You would have been outside my reach, and the Moretti family is not." He paused. "I needed you in here. I needed time to dismantle the arrangement from the other end, to make the contract void without making you the liability in the transaction. By getting the Moretti side to withdraw. Yes, and you haven't yet." "I have," he said. "As of this morning, the withdrawal is confirmed and documented." He looked at her steadily. "Your father no longer has a buyer, which means the only move he has left is to come here directly and try to negotiate a reinstatement of the original terms. He will do that within the next 24 hours. And when he does, I need you to know everything before he arrives." She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the covered frame on the far wall. She stood up and walked to it, and reached up and took the fabric off. Underneath was a photograph. A woman in her late 40s, dark hair, a smile that was not quite at the camera, but slightly to the left of it. The way people smile when they don't know they're being photographed. She looked at the photograph for a long time, and then she set the fabric on the shelf and came back to the desk. She sat down again. She placed the contract back on the desk between them. She looked at her father's signature, and then she looked at Dominic. He loved her, she said. Not her father. The woman in the photograph. She meant Dominic had loved his mother. She meant this is what that love cost him, and what it cost him to contain the cost. He said nothing. His jaw moved once and then was still. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not yet. Not until my father comes and I've said what I need to say to him directly." She placed her hand flat on the contract. "After that, we are going to renegotiate. Not you and my father. You and me. As two people who are going to decide together what this looks like going forward. If it looks like anything at all." She looked at him. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He looked at her hand on the contract. Then he looked at her face. Something in him settled. Not the settling of relief. Not the settling of someone who has won something. But the settling of a person who has been standing in a particular posture for a very long time and has just been told they can change position. "Yes," he said. She picked up the contract and set it on the left side of the desk, beside the divorce filing that was still there from 3 days ago, and the two documents sat next to each other in the flat, noon, light, like the before and after of a story she had not known she was in. She stood. She walked to the door. She stopped and looked back at him, at the photograph on the wall, now uncovered, at the man sitting in the chair on the wrong side of his own desk, at the entire room that was finally, 3 days after she had walked into it with 12 pages and a plan, beginning to make sense. "Your 2 days started this morning," she said, "so we have until tomorrow." He nodded. She left the door open behind her. Her father arrived at 9:14 the following morning. She heard the elevator before she heard him. The same sound she had been listening for since the night before. The specific mechanical note of the building's private lift moving between floors. She was already downstairs, already dressed, already standing in the sitting room with her coffee finished and her hands steady, because she had made a decision in the middle of the night, and decisions of that kind required the body to be ready before the mind could talk it out of them. Dominic was in the study. He had left the door open. She did not go to him. Elliot Carver walked into the sitting room and stopped when he saw her standing instead of sitting. He was wearing the same charcoal suit he always wore for things he considered important, and he was carrying a leather case she recognized as the one he used for documents. And when he saw her face, he made a small adjustment to his own expression that she had learned to read over 30 years as the adjustment of a man who has walked into a room expecting one conversation and is recalibrating for another. "Serena." He set the case down. He moved toward her. "Don't," she said, quietly, not cruelly. She said it the way she said things that were not negotiable. He stopped. "I read the contract, Dad." The room went. The particular kind of still that rooms go when something that has been in the air for a very long time finally lands. Her father looked at her. His face went through several things in quick succession, and then settled into the expression she had been most afraid of seeing, because it was the one she had not expected. Not anger, not denial, but a specific and terrible grief. The grief of a man who has known for a long time that a reckoning was coming and has not, in all that time, found a way to be ready for it. "I can explain," he said. "You can try." She kept her voice even. She had practiced even. It was the only weapon she had ever trusted. "But I want you to know before you start that I have read all 41 pages and the addendum. I understand the original terms. I understand what you provided 12 years ago, and what you received in exchange, and what that provision cost the person it was provided about." She looked at him steadily. "I also understand what you tried to do 3 months ago, and again last week. I understand the Moretti contact, and I understand that the figure beside their name in the addendum is what you were going to take for me." Her father closed his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed for a long moment, and she looked at him, at the charcoal suit and the leather case, and the 61 years of a man who had made one catastrophic decision and had spent the rest of his life building structures to contain it. Structures that had eventually required using his daughter as a load-bearing wall. She looked at him the way you look at something that used to be one thing and is now another. Not with hatred, which would have required more energy than she had for him, but with the clear and slightly exhausted vision of a person who has just finished a very long translation. "I was going to use the money to disappear," he said. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. "I was not going to leave you in a bad situation. I was going to take you with me, without asking me." A pause. "Yes? The way you arranged the marriage, without asking me." He said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. She had not asked it expecting an answer. The withdrawal from the Moretti side is documented. She said, "Dominic confirmed it this morning, which means you have no buyer, and you have no leverage, and you have no move left, except this one. Coming here and trying to renegotiate directly." She looked at him. "I'm telling you now, before you go into that study, that there is nothing to renegotiate. The arrangement stands as it is. That is my decision, not Dominic's." "Mine." She let that settle. You are protected under the original terms as long as the marriage continues. Nothing changes on that side. But what changes is that you do not contact the Moretti family or anyone else in that category again. And you do not make any further decisions that involve me without my knowledge and my explicit agreement. If that is not acceptable to you, you can tell me now. Her father looked at her for a long time. She watched him work through it, watched him measure what she was offering against what he had come here, hoping to take, watched him arrive at the place she had already been waiting for him to arrive at, the place where there was only one door, and she was holding it open. I understand, he said. Good. She took a breath. She let it out slowly. I love you, Dad. That has not changed. But I need you to understand that I am not a clause in your contract, and I am not a term in your arrangement, and I am not something that gets moved between families when the math changes. I am your daughter, which is a relationship that requires you to treat me like one. And that starts today. He nodded. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been called to account by the one person whose account he actually cared about, which was the only kind of account that costs anything real. She picked up the leather case from the floor and handed it to him. There's nothing in there you need to use today. Go home. He took the case. He looked at her once more. A long look. The look of a man saying something he did not have the words for. And then he walked to the elevator. The doors opened. He stepped in. They closed. She stood in the sitting room alone and listened to the sound of the elevator descending and felt, inside her chest, the particular sensation of a structure being dismantled that had been in place for so long she had stopped noticing it was there. Not relief. Exactly. Something quieter. The sensation of weight that has been removed, not all at once, but incrementally, each piece taken off until you notice the absence of all of them together. She turned. Dominic was standing in the doorway of the study. He had heard everything, which she had known he would, because she had not lowered her voice. He was looking at her with the same unguarded expression he had worn in the study the day before, the one that had no name in any language she spoke, but that she was beginning to be able to read, a face that had learned to show very little for a very long time and was slowly, in the presence of someone who was paying attention, learning that it was possible to show more. He crossed the room and went to the desk in the corner of the sitting room, a smaller desk that she had never paid much attention to, and he opened the center drawer and took out the divorce filing she had given him 4 days ago. He walked back to her and held it out. She looked at the document. She looked at him. You're giving it back to me. I told you, whatever you want to do after you had the full picture. I wouldn't stop you. His voice was level. His eyes were not. That was the agreement. She took the document from him. She held it. She looked at the 12 pages she had spent 11 months preparing, at the careful architecture of her intended exit, at the language she had constructed to describe the end of something she had entered without understanding what it was. She thought about the 2 years in this building, the rhythms she had memorized, the rhythms that had saved her, the accumulated knowledge of a person who had been paying close attention in a house full of things she was not supposed to see. She thought about a man who had carried an arrangement built on a harm that had been done to him and had chosen to use that arrangement to contain further harm rather than to perpetuate it, who had held the information that could have changed everything and had made the wrong choice in how he withheld it, and the right choice in what he was trying to protect. She thought about what renegotiation meant when the 2 people doing it were starting from an honest place for the first time. She set the document on the desk beside them. She did not give it back to him. She did not put it away. She left it there. Visible. Present. A door that was still open. Because she was not a woman who closed doors she might still need. And she was not yet sure enough of anything to close this one. I'm staying, she said. For now. Not because I can't leave. Because I'm choosing not to. She looked at him. That is a significant distinction, and I need you to understand it. I understand it. He held her gaze. I've always understood the difference. She believed him. That was new too. Believing him. And she did not fully trust the newness of it yet, but she recognized it as something real and not as something performed. And she had been in the business of distinguishing between those two things long enough to know the difference. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, New York was doing what it always did, pressing on regardless. Taxis and construction, and the low permanent hum of a city that did not pause for any particular reckoning, personal or otherwise. The light through the windows was the specific October light of late morning, warm despite the cold outside, the kind of light that made everything look slightly more possible than it had an hour before. She looked at the divorce filing on the desk. She looked at the open door of the study, at the photograph on the far wall now uncovered, at the woman with the smile that was not quite at the camera. She looked at the man across from her who was watching her with the patience of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, that some things cannot be pressed. We have a great deal to discuss, she said. Yes, starting with the fact that if we are going to continue to live in the same building, you are going to explain things to me rather than manage them. All of them, going forward. Yes. Something shifted in the line of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The expression of a man who has been living in a very particular kind of tension for a very long time and can feel, for the first time, the tension beginning to change into something else. She walked to the window and looked out at the city below, at Manhattan in mid-morning, at the East River, a sliver of silver between the buildings to the east, at the sky which had decided, finally, to be clear. Behind her she heard him move to the chair near the window, the one she had sat in during the early months when she was still mapping the house, the one with the good view. He sat down. He did not speak. He waited. The way she had learned he waited, with the specific quality of attention of a person who has decided that the other person in the room is worth the wait. She turned away from the window. She sat down across from him, and for the first time in 2 years in that house, they began,